Good evening, everyone. As they say, I'm the only person now standing between you and the real change agents from the three companies. But when Jim, and I just want to say to Jim, congratulations on the crowd. It's evolved in an extraordinary way over the years, and it's become a really quite wonderful gathering of key people in the field. So well done. But when you asked me to focus on this theme, the art of change, I thought, what am I going to start with? Well, this image fairly promptly came to mind. Many of you will know it. It was only once I'd actually stuck in the slide, I realized that there's a flash of pubic hair in there, for which I apologize, and I'll try and rush on before most of you see it. When Jim asked the question around the art of change, I thought, I love art, I love painting. One painting I remember from probably about 8 or 9 years ago from Palo Alto was this one. I was visiting HP's labs there, and this image, which shows Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, the two founders of HP, as most of you know, and the people who behind the HP way. I thought, well, it was actually quite a graphic image, which showed people who started off with one change agenda, suddenly finding that the change agenda that they had originally embraced was mutating, and in a way planet Earth stood for that. If you're really interested in art and you really dig into it, you find that one of the core concepts is that of the golden mean or golden ratio. And if you look around through painting in particular, you'll find it everywhere once you start looking. And just recently, and some copies of this report are on your tables, and I shouldn't really call it a report, I should call it a dramatization, or almost a sort of, my colleague Sam Larker here calls it a playper. It started off as a short report, it developed into a play along the way, and it tries to capture the dynamics in boardrooms and C-suites that we've observed over many years. And what, again, we're looking for is some sort of golden mean ratio. Just to pick up what Jim just said, I'd love to be in the VW boardroom at this very moment, because I think the way they decide to handle this crisis, this scandal, will actually set the parameters of much of this debate for quite some time to come. So in that short report, we tried to find some way of distilling what we had been seeing. And we talked about a ratio agenda. And I'm just going to run through each of those. Einstein, many of you will remember, once said, reality is an illusion, but it's a pretty persistent one. We all live in realities, and we all inherit them from people who founded the organizations that we work with. And one of the ways in which we have tried to explain that to business people has been to use the World Economic Forum analysis around the system-level pressures that are increasingly pushing in on business. And if you're in California, I know regularly on the phone to friends there, and the drought crisis there has become a really urgent, painful reality. You find the same in Brazil and elsewhere. I won't go through all of the dynamics here, but in a sense what's happening is that a set of issues that when I came into this field were pretty much discrete, individual issues, are all increasingly bonding together into what can only be described as a system-level crisis. And sitting on top of the reaction vessel, the pressure cooker in a way, is a lid which, whatever you think about the United Nations, I think is precariously weak now, but we'll see what happens in Paris in December. And then there are people who are taking business leaders out into that different set of realities. Leaders Quest is one of the organizations that we admire, and they take people, for example, 140 top people from Bain, and they dump them in a landfill site outside Mumbai. Or they take 140 people from Barclays, including the former CEO, and take them to a slum in Nairobi. And this is partly to jolt people into a different sense of reality. And I think that is very much part of the art that we all have to practice. But alongside that is this uncomfortable area of ambition. And certainly in this country, when I was being educated, ambition wasn't always seen to be a good thing. But it's interesting, in our field, increasingly, we see ambition as actually not just a good thing, but a great and desirable thing. And I think this Dong Energy ad just captures some sense of that, the glorious individual coming up with a new vision and beginning to execute against that. And Jim just mentioned Tesla. I think when I think about CEOs around the world, there's no one I would really at the moment put on a par with Elon Musk of Tesla, SolarCity, SpaceX, and so on. I love his ambition. I'm not going to read it out. Many of you will be going to see the film The Martian shortly. He wants to be there too. That's the level of ambition the guy has. But the sorts of people we're more used to, people like Paul Pullman has become almost a saint in this space. I hope Unilever don't trip up too soon. But most extraordinary, perhaps, of all of the leaders who are now stepping up and expressing a really exciting sense of stretch and ambition, I'd put Pope Francis very much in that space. And this is, I think, signaling a shift in our agenda. The question I'll come on to in a moment is, should we have more technical people in CSR and similar teams? The question also is, should we have people who know how to change cultures? And I think some of the change agents you will hear from in a moment are great at that, but I think we've got to get better. The third letter stands for goals and targets. We had the privilege early last year of spending quite some time with Interface in Europe. And the reason we did that was that they had very recently hit 3 zero-based targets. And Ray Anderson, who many of you will remember, set the Mission Zero set of targets quite some time ago. But many of his colleagues didn't think that they would ever get there as a company. But they hit those 3 targets. So that was carbon-based energy, zero, zero waste landfill, and net zero water use. So people are setting targets and using them sensibly. But in that stretch agenda document that you will have on your tables, hopefully, there is this diagram, and it's an attempt to express the challenge that we collectively now face. So we're becoming really quite good in terms of reporting and so on in covering the horizontal axis here. There are variously described as 6 or 8 different forms of capital: financial, physical, natural, social, and so on. So we're getting better at that. We're not great at linking our reporting vertically. So from the level of the field, the farm, whatever, the factory, right up to the level of the atmosphere or biosphere. And one of the organizations I know is represented in the room today, the Future Fit Business Benchmark, is very much playing into that space. And then you have the longitudinal axis. So I think we're all probably excited about the Sustainable Development Goals. I think there are way too many of them for anyone really to treat them as anything but a menu. But the targets component of this agenda is going to become much more urgent, and I think this sort of 3-dimensional component of the agenda will become very much more important. The I is for incentives. Now, I'm going to focus on organizational incentives, but also I think human, individual, team incentives are absolutely crucial there as well. And there's a table here this evening on breakthrough technologies, which is the one that I will be on. And I think this is a remarkable moment in this whole space where suddenly you have basically startup organizations that are disrupting entire industries and in relatively short order. So Uber, for example, I saw a study just recently that said in the United States alone, in the next 10 years, something like 10 million jobs will go. Those aren't just taxi drivers, they're not just people in automobile manufacturing. This is a systemic change coming at us, whether you like Uber or not, and I find them pretty grim in some respects. But I think what's happening, many of you will have done MBAs or gone to business school or similar. You'll recognize the traditional adoption curve here. What we're starting to see is something that people describe as the Big Bang or shark's fin adoption curve. And I think we're at one of those moments where it's going to be very unsettling for companies, whether or not they're confronted by Uber. And the scale of the losses that people are already suffering in relation to those sorts of trends are immense. The Economist 2 years ago already, was talking about the 20 energy power utilities in Europe and their loss of something like 500 billion euros to that point. So it was a 1 trillion euro market, and half of that value had been wiped out by the fact that nuclear was having to be shut down, by the fact that renewables were increasingly coming into the energy mix. That's the downside. The upside is that there are people now tracking quite intensively the market opportunities in this sort of space. I always feel very nervous when I see market forecasts, particularly when they go into the trillions. But I think the overall message is that the scale of the market opportunities are in the process of going out off the curve. And just earlier this year, we did something called the Breakthrough Forecast, where we looked at 21 market sweet spots and started to put market valuations on those. So finally, outcomes. And these diagrams are going to look just slightly stretched because I had to change the slide format late on. Some of you will have had that sort of problem. So they've got slightly fatter than they should be. This is a diagram we started to put together recently to try and give ourselves a sense, and a sense also to the people that we work with, of where we are in all of this. And it runs left to right in the horizontal axis from trying to minimize the environmental footprints, negative impact of business and so on, through increasingly to trying to maximize or optimize the positive outcomes. And in the middle, you've got zero-based targets, net positive, and some stuff like that. But I think the critical axis is the vertical one, which takes us from incrementalism, which is where most of our work, most of our teams currently operate, towards the sort of breakthrough outcomes, which are better measured on almost an exponential scale. And increasingly, I find the work of people like the Singularity University really challenging in this space. The B Corporation movement, I think, potentially plays into that upper space. So if you think about companies operating across this sort of landscape, and you think about the breakdown area, there are plenty of companies that will make a lot of money out of dealing with breakdowns. So G4S is developing, not always terribly successfully, migrant caps. That would be one example. If you go to change as usual, which is basically companies working within the system that they find, but not trying to change the system itself, you have people like Walmart doing extraordinary work to pressure their supply chains in the right direction. But I think the really interesting space is the top right-hand one, which is the breakthrough space. Tesla is put there partly for the reasons that Jim has already mentioned. But for me, the question is, how does the crowd itself move into that breakthrough space? It doesn't mean that we stop doing the crisis management of breakdown scenarios. The migrant crisis is a very good example of why we can't abandon that. The change as usual piece, it remains really important. It would be wonderful if companies like VW could actually deliver on the promises that they make. But I think this stretch domain is crucial. And then just a final slide. I think, I've worked in this space for 40 years. Every so often there's a moment where things start to change in quite a big way. I think we're at one of those moments. And it's partly the 2015 events, the Sustainable Development Goals launch, the COP21 process. It's partly the sorts of crises that we're seeing with companies like VW. But behind the scenes, there is a raft of new technologies beginning to come through. And I just pick up a point I just touched on briefly earlier on. I think CSR, shared values, sustainability teams will increasingly have to be much more technology savvy than they currently are. At the same time, as a set of movements, we've got to get much better at engaging people like Tesla and some of the people driving these very different forms of technology and linked business models. So we're about to hear from 3 companies. I just wanted to put up what my expectations. I've been asked to comment very, very briefly, pithily, as each of them says what they're going to say. But when I think about toy makers, I think about the people who are actually trying to stretch young people's imaginations. When I think about retailers, and I'm currently working with Tesco, for example, they play potentially a really important market gatekeeper role in this space. So how do they stretch that? And how do they help both producers and consumers over time do the right thing? And then banks, we've been through a troubling period with banks, but at their best, they help us deliver sustainable outcomes, including sustainable value. So a few perspectives. I'll comment as we hear the presentations, but thank you very much for your attention so far.